We practice in the Potteries the fine old English plan of not calling things by their names. We are one town, one unseparated mass of streets. We are, in fact, the 12th largest town in the United Kingdom, though you'd never guess it. And the chief of our retail commerce and of our amusements are congregated in the centre of our town, as the custom is. But do not imagine that we will be content to call ourselves one town. No, we pretend that we are 6 towns. And to carry out that pretense, we have 6 town halls, 6 mayors or chief bailiffs, 6 sanitary inspectors, 6 everything, including 6 jealousies. We find it so much more economical, convenient, and dignified in dealing with public health, education, and railway, canal, and tramway companies to act by means of 6 mutually jealous authorities. To understand the Potteries, it is necessary to dip into geology and geography, these 2 sciences being, in fact, the key to nearly all human history. If you look at a geological map of Staffordshire, you'll see at the northern end of this county, amid expanses of brown, which means sandstone, and blue, which means limestone, a solitary little triangular patch of dark grey, which means coal. The Potteries is in the middle of that patch. Geology has set it apart. And if you look at an ordinary map of Staffordshire, you will see that the Potteries is cut off from the rest of England on the north by wild and hilly moorlands, and on the south by the remains of ancient forests. You will see also that there is no navigable river anywhere near it. In brief, it has got lost in the very middle of the island. And if you looked at ancient maps, you'd see that the roads to it were few, and that in particular Watling Street passed far to the south on its way to Chester and far to the north on its way to York. The Potteries is the Potteries because on that precise spot of the surface of the British Empire there were deposits of clay and quick-burning coal close to the surface. If this was not an invitation on the part of nature to make pots, what was it? Wherever the clay and coal were found close together, there a town sprang up. It was only a tiny town because 9 or 10 centuries ago the demand for pots was limited and the processes of manufacture primitive. And each tiny town kept itself to itself, because the landscape was hilly and irregular, it was not a smooth plain, and the roads were naught but mule tracks. Cut off from the surrounding country in spirit by the peculiarity of its manufacture, and in body by the difficulty of access and its wild environment, the Potteries was indeed isolated. It acquired through centuries the habit of solitude. It was an island in an island. And even when, in the 18th century, the canals of England were dug, the Potteries had difficulty in connecting itself with the outer world. Newcastle under Lyme objected to canals. I have not yet mentioned Newcastle under Lyme, which is a very ancient town lying just to the west of the Potteries, on a piece of ground where there is a fault in the coal deposits. A clean town, aristocratic. It was sending 2 members to Parliament in the 14th century. The Potteries had to fight hard and long with its old-fashioned neighbour, Newcastle, before it could possess itself of such a new-fashioned convenience as a canal. The same with railways. The main line, now the London and North Western, that runs from London through Stafford to the north, ought to have gone right through the Potteries on its way to Crewe. But it didn't. The stronger influences were against railways, and the line was diverted through fields and villages that had no special need of it. On the 28 miles between Stafford and Crewe of the 4-track way of the greatest line in England, not a town, and a solid population of 250,000 within gunshot. English methods, that is to say, the preposterous side of English methods. Hence, the Potteries had to construct a railway of its own. It did construct a railway of its own, the North Staffordshire, which eventually became so important that the North Western had to run its expresses over it. And today, when you return from your visit, the express will rush you without a stop over the 146 miles between Stoke and Euston in 3 hours or less. This is travelling. This is a sign of the great change.
From the death of Simon Fuge. We were able to talk about this. We were able to talk about the singular scenery of coal dust, pot shards, flame and steam through which the train wound its way. It was squalid ugliness, but it was squalid ugliness on a scale so vast and overpowering that it became sublime. Great furnaces gleamed red in the twilight, and their fires were reflected in horrible black canals. Processions of heavy vapour drifted in all directions across the sky over what acres of mean and miserable brown architecture. The air was alive with the most extraordinary, weird, gigantic sounds. I do not think the Five Towns will ever be described. Dante lived too soon.
When the Manchester Express sets you down at Stoke-on-Trent station, which is the traffic centre of the district, you can within 5 minutes feel the dirt of the Potteries sticking to your skin. You see about you a determined and, perhaps to you, somewhat brusque population which eyes you with provincial cautiousness, as if to say, "What are you doing here?" You may leave the station and travel through miles and miles and yet miles of streets, chiefly muddy with a black mud, and see nothing but tramcars whizzing up and down between endless buildings obviously not designed by Christopher Wren or Inigo Jones. And rearing up behind the buildings, 10,000 chimneys, each trying to send black smoke to paradise, and not succeeding. If you escape from the streets, you'll fall into huge cinder wastes, or lose yourself among artificial mountain ranges of mine refuse. And when you do get a view of a distant horizon, that horizon will surely be crowned by a pithead and a scarf of smoke, and the intervening rural country will have the colour not of grass, but of dried peas. And you will find everywhere the same bland spirit of making it do. My native heath, thanks to the enterprise of London newspapers and the indestructibility of picturesque lies, has the reputation of being quite unlike the rest of England. But when I set foot in it after absence, it seems to me the most English piece of England that I ever came across. With extraordinary clearness I see it as absurdly, ridiculously, splendidly English. All the English characteristics are quite remarkably exaggerated in the Potteries. We're only just a tiny bit more English than you, that's all. And the Potteries is English industry in little, a glass for English manufacture to see itself in. Besides, when we like, we can produce the finest earthenware in the world. In an earthenware manufactory they have, after 12 centuries, thoroughly learned one lesson, namely, that clay is a living thing, and therefore enigmatic. Indeed, it presents so many enigmas that the potters have had to divide their forces and attack the creature by installments. A plate may appear to you a ridiculously simple article, and you think that if you had to make it, you would just dig up the right sort of clay, fashion it, and burn it. But the right sort of clay does not naturally exist. The basis of every earthenware manufactory is a workshop where bearded and reverend men thoughtfully examine several different natural sorts of clay and cause them to be mixed together by the brute force of machines, in the hope that the product will be white and serviceable. These men are grey. They've grown grey in the vain study of bits of their Mother Earth, which still not seldom play them tricks. And they are the descendants of similar men. These men have naught to do with the shaping of clay. They would be capable of looking at a plate and saying, "What is this? I've never seen such a thing." Their affair is only with clay in the shapeless form. Another set of men take up the attack when the time comes for persuading clay to assume definite forms. Machinery helps them, but merely as a brainless servant. In many manufactures, the man is servant of the machine. It will probably never be so in pottery. The fingers of these men and boys are finer tools than any wood or metal could be. See the boy pull off a piece of clay from the big lump and roll it. Watch his fingers. That boy's fingers might be 1,200 years old in skill. Look away, look back, and lo, what was a hunch of clay is a little plate, and there is no clay left over. See the man nearby making a mug with his fingers over a revolving table. The mug grows like a flower. The man seems to be drawing it upwards by magic out of the table. The table comes to a standstill, and there the mug is perfect. See the miner workers carrying off these soft and fragile vessels. If you or I touched one of them, the result would be ruin. And we come back to yet another set of students of clay, the men who imprison the clay, now in the form of vessels, but entirely useless as such, in a vast fiery inferno, the men who victimize clay, who change clay so effectually that it can by no chemical process ever be changed back again to its original state. These men are more mystically priest-like than the others. They often work at night. Once a job is begun, they never under any consideration leave it until it's finished. A single indiscretion and thousands of pounds worth of moulded clay may be rendered futile and valueless. And they themselves do not know what is going on in the inferno which they've created. They can only hope that the clay under the ordeal of fire is not behaving too obstreperously. For it is obvious they may not enter their own inferno to see how affairs are moving. They have to guess. They are very good guessers. They've been guessing since before the Norman conquest of England. But a guess remains a guess. And when they let the fire down, their pessimism or their optimism asserts itself, and during the cooling period torments or enheartens them. The cooling period is long, nearly a couple of days, and even then the ovens are so hot that you or I could not enter them without fainting. But the potter, stripped to the waist, enters nonchalantly the ghostly interior, lined and piled with pale martyred vessels, and carries them out in parcels. And at last, in the light of day, the experts can regard the clay and decide whether it has beaten them again. It always does beat them to a certain extent. What is this yellow stain on this teapot? Nobody can tell. A caprice of the clay's freakish protest against fire. Sometimes a whole oven full of stuff is damaged, sometimes only a small percentage, but never, never does the entire consignment of clay behave as it was expected to behave, and as it ought to behave. And even now your simple, easy-looking plate is far from achieved. It looks rather more like a whitewashed dog biscuit than a plate. It generally has to be decorated, at any rate it has to be glazed, and it has to go through the ordeal of fire at least once more, perhaps twice more. And each further process is a new opportunity for the clay to prove its intractableness and its unforeseeableness. And each further process is presided over by lifelong students of just that particular part of the clay's evolution. Even the packer, sitting among straw and wrapping up each piece separately and protecting the clay from itself, has to know quite a lot about the willfulness of earthenware when subjected to certain strains. Earthenware will often maintain itself intact in a railroad smash, only to shatter in the delicate touch of a general servant aged 19. Have you not heard her say, "Please, the handle came off in my hand"? To the very last, clay is incalculable. No person of imagination who has taken the trouble to follow with intelligence the odyssey of clay, from its stratum in the earth to its apotheosis on the domestic table, can pick up a simple plate without a certain emotion. The clay of it is indeed dead. But what adventures led up to its fiery demise, and what human associations are embedded in its everlasting rigidity. Strange that Five Towns children do not play at being potters. I can remember seeing my paternal grandfather once, when I was about 3 years of age. All I know of him is that he was said to be the best turner in the pottery trade. This statement may have been true, or my grandfather may have been merely a fine turner, upraised by family pride into the finest. He was a superior working man, intensely respectable. He died young. My paternal grandmother died before I first saw the smoke of the Potteries.
From the card. Edward Henry Machin first saw the smoke on the 27th of May, 1867, in Broome Street, Bursley, the most ancient of the 5 towns. Broome Street runs down from St. Luke's Square straight into the Shropshire Union Canal, and consists partly of buildings known as pot banks, until they come to be sold by auction, when auctioneers describe them as extensive earthenware manufactories, and partly of cottages, whose highest rent is 4 and 6 a week. In such surroundings was an extraordinary man born. He was the only anxiety of a widowed mother, who gained her livelihood and his by making up ladies' own materials in ladies' own houses. Mrs. Machin, however, had a speciality apart from her vocation. She could wash flannel with less shrinking than any other woman in the district, and she could wash fine lace without ruining it. Thus often she came to sew, and remained to wash. A somewhat gloomy woman, thin, with a tongue, but I liked her. She saved a certain amount of time every day by addressing her son as Denry, instead of Edward Henry.
My grandfather had 2 sons and a daughter. The elder son was a pottery painter. The potteries being too small for him, he went to London to a cottage in Lambeth. He exhibited a pottery painting in his window. Sir Henry Dalton, strolling that way, saw it and engaged the artist for his Lambeth works. His younger brother, my father, began and failed as a pottery manufacturer. Then he took to pawnbroking and cared not for it. My dealings with literature go back, I suppose, some 33 years to that pawnbroker's shop. We came together thus, literature and I. It was in a kitchen at midday, and I was waiting for my dinner, hungry and clean in a tartan frock with a pinafore over it. I'd washed my own face and dried it, and I remembered that my eyes smarted with lingering soap, and my skin was drawn by the evaporation of moisture on a cold day. I held in my hand a single leaf which had escaped from a printed book. How it came into that chubby fist I cannot recall. The reminiscence begins with it already there. I gazed hard at the paper, and pretended with all my powers to be completely absorbed in its contents. I pretended to ignore someone who was rattling saucepans at the kitchen range. On my left, a very long and mysterious passage led to the pawnshop, all full of black bundles. I heard my brother crying at the other end of the passage, and his noisy naughtiness offended me. For myself, I felt excessively good with my paper. Never since have I been so filled with the sense of perfect righteousness. Here was I, clean, quiet, sedate, studious, and there was my brother, the illiterate young hooligan, disturbing the sacrosanct shop, and, what was worse, ignorant of his inferiority to me. Disgusted with him, I passed through the kitchen into another shop on the right, still conning the passage with soapy, smarting eyes. At this point, the light of memory is switched off. The printed matter, which sprang out of nothingness, vanishes back into the same. After the miraculous appearance and disappearance of that torn leaf, I remember almost nothing of literature for several years. I was 6 or so when the ugly duckling aroused in me the melancholy of life, gave me to see the deep sadness which pervades all romance, beauty, and adventure. I laughed heartily at the old henbird's wise remark that the world extended past the next field and much further. I could perceive the humour of that. But when the ugly duckling at last flew away on his strong pinions, and when he met the swans and was accepted as an equal, then I felt sorrowful, agreeably sorrowful. It seemed to me that nothing could undo, atone for, the grief and humiliation of the false duckling's early youth. I brooded over the injustice of his misfortunes for days, and the swans who welcomed him struck me as proud, cold, and supercilious in their politeness. I've never read The Ugly Duckling since those days. It survives in my memory as a long and complex narrative, crowded with vague and mysterious allusions, and wet with the tears of things. No novel, it was a prodigious novel for me, has more deliciously disturbed me. The pawnbroking establishment was transferred to my aunt, who conducted it for a long period. My father was ambitious. At the age of nearly 30, he did what to me has always seemed a marvelous thing. He decided to become a solicitor, and at the age of 34 he became one and set up in practice in the Potteries. This was something of a feat for a man of his age, poor and with a growing family. Although he actually read little, beyond the usual Dickens and George MacDonald, he had a curious detached interest in books, and his library was the largest of my youthful experience. I estimate it at 1,000 volumes, mostly dull or worthless, but all dignified. He had a passion for filling his offspring with information, at small trouble to himself. When any point of dispute arose, he would say, "Luke it up." We luked it up. He secretly thought that his children were the best behaved and the most gifted in the district, but to our faces he seldom praised us, and never without grave reserves. When I won 20 guineas for a short story in a weekly paper, he said, "Well, it's better than a bat in the eye with a burnt stick." I took this for high laudation. In addition to being a disciplinarian, he loved to see others work. Never would he allow his boys to go out and play in the evening like other boys. He relentlessly, ruthlessly stimulated his children's ambitions, and his influence over us was immense because he was keenly interested in us. I grew up in an atmosphere of sustained effort, of grim sticking it, of silent endurance, of never being beaten by circumstance. I am now glad of it. At school, I was chiefly bored. I went to 3 schools. The first is not worth mentioning. Well, the Burslem Wesleyan Day School. The second, the Burslem Endowed School, is hardly worth mentioning. The headmaster introduced the horizontal bar, single stick, bronze medals — I lost mine for arithmetic — and marching into school and out of school to a tune of his own playing on a harmonium. The third, Newcastle Middle School, was better. The school had a good reputation, doubtless deserved, according to contemporary standards. I despised it for a strange reason, namely, because, well aware that I knew nothing, I nevertheless rose with extraordinary rapidity to the top of the school. I thought, if I am captain of this school, what a rotten school it must be, and what rotters must be the other boys. I left school at 16 in 1883.
From Clayhanger. The various agencies which society has placed at the disposal of a parent had been at work on Edwin in one way or another for at least a decade, in order to equip him for just this very day when he should step into the world. The moment must therefore be regarded as dramatic, the first crucial moment of an experiment long and elaborately prepared. Knowledge was admittedly the armour and the weapon of one about to try conclusions with the world, and many people for many years had been engaged in providing Edwin with knowledge. He had received, in fact, a good education, or even, as some said, a thoroughly sound education. Assuredly as complete an equipment of knowledge as could be obtained in the county, for the curriculum of the Old Castle High School was less in accord with common sense than that of the Middle School. He knew, however, nothing of natural history, and in particular of himself, and of the mechanism of the body and mind through which his soul had to express and fulfill itself. Not one word of information about either physiology or psychology had ever been breathed to him, nor had it ever occurred to anyone around him that such information was needful. And as no one had tried to explain to him the mysteries which he carried about with him inside that fair skin of his, so no one had tried to explain to him the mysteries by which he was hemmed in, either mystically through religion or rationally through philosophy. Never in chapel or at Sunday school had a difficulty been genuinely faced, and as for philosophy, he had not the slightest conception of what it meant. He imagined that a philosopher was one who made the best of a bad job, and he had never heard the word used in any other sense. He had great potential intellectual curiosity, but nobody had thought to stimulate it by even casually telling him that the finest minds of humanity had been trying to systemize the mysteries for quite 25 centuries. Of physical science, he had been taught nothing, save a grotesque perversion to the effect that gravity was a force which drew things towards the centre of the earth. In the matter of chemistry, it had been practically demonstrated to him scores of times, so that he should never forget this grand basic truth, that sodium and potassium may be relied upon to fizz flamingly about on a surface of water. Of geology, he was perfectly ignorant, though he lived in a district whose whole livelihood depended on the scientific use of geological knowledge. And as he had acquired absolutely nothing about political economy or about logic, and was therefore at the mercy of the first agreeable sophistry that might take his fancy by storm, his unfitness to commence the business of being a citizen almost reached perfection.
After leaving school, I at once sat for the London matric and passed. 2 or 3 years later, I sat for the London LLB intermediate. 3 subjects, you had to pass in all of them. I failed in all of them. I sat again and failed in one of them. This commie tragedy finished my education. School, I admit, had taught me something more valuable than grammar and geography. It taught me how to keep to a timetable, and to be in a certain place at a certain hour, and to complete more or less a certain task by a certain hour, and no nonsense permitted. The seed of this lesson did not fall on stony ground. I grew more and more addicted to the organization of my time. The consequence was that I have acquired an unmerited reputation for being a hard worker. I am not a hard worker, I am merely an organized worker. As regards my self-education, as distinguished from the education imposed on me, it began feebly at the age of 21, when I quitted the romance of the Potteries for the prose of London. I learned to speak German, and in course of time lost this pleasing faculty through disuse of it. I learned to read Italian, and lost this faculty too. French I acquired permanently. 4 or 5 years in the office of a London lawyer's enabled me to learn a bit about human nature, and 4 or 5 years in weekly journalism forced me to learn how to capture by words the attention of the average man, a personage, let me say, whom I deeply respect. But what more than anything else helped me to help myself in education was the frequenting of artists in other arts. Painters, designers, sculptors, musicians. These friends and acquaintances unconsciously indicated to me other ways of seeing and feeling than the ways employed in literature. How did I learn to write? I didn't. I am still learning to write, and by the only method. You learn to write by writing, and writing, and writing. But you must take each word by itself, examining it as you would examine a criminal, and by avoiding ready-made phrases. There is no harder work than learning to write. It is so hard that it prevents general education in the customary sense of the term. But the novelist, who has to deal with everything in life, has a great privilege. He is permitted to have no exact knowledge of anything in life, except his craft, and not always that. how to become the author of the novel. The beginner should proceed through the following stages. He will invent and elaborate the plot. Now, the action should spring out of the characters, and the characters should spring out of the general environment. Therefore, the first dim, indefinable efforts of the imagination will be concerned with the environment. By the environment, I mean the place or places where the action is to pass, the general class and sort of people involved, and the broad effect of landscapes and other surroundings. The mind must ponder on these things until they begin to take shape. Then follows the conjuring up of one or two, probably not more than three at the outside, appropriate principal characters. And at length, when these have shown themselves, the nature of the action must be considered and evolved. Of course, it may well happen that the first naked hint of the proposed book will be a hint of an action or a situation, or of a character entirely separate from any notion of general environment. But the beginner must take care to carry that hint backward to a suitable environment first, and not forward into any detailed action until the environment and characters are more or less defined. After my first literary achievement, the publication of my short story, The Artist Model, in the magazine Titbits, for which I was awarded 1 guinea for the prize titbit, and working in Fleet Street, I wrote my first novel, A Man from the North. It brought me neither cash nor renown. But in it I wrote, there exists in the North a certain kind of man who was born to be a Londoner. Myself, the ugly duckling. In March 1898, I wrote an article on George Moore's novel, A Mummer's Wife. More than a masterpiece, it's one of the supreme novels of the century. Mr. Moore is at home everywhere. He writes of nothing he has not observed. And I wish to tell you that it was the first chapters of A Mummer's Wife which opened my eyes to the romantic nature of the district that I had already inhabited for over 20 years. These chapters are set in Hanley. The comic opera Les Cloches de Corneville played the Theatre Royal, Hanley, from the 28th of May to the 2nd of June, 1883. George Moore came with the company because he was trying to write an English translation of it. He failed, but he went on to write about his experiences with the company. He called it A Mummer's Wife. In it, the owners of a draper's shop in Hanley take in a lodger, Dick Lennox, actor-manager of a company performing at the Theatre Royal. The draper's young wife runs off with him to become an actress, and eventually dies in poverty. As a critic, I reviewed this book, and it was a revelation to me. It showed me the tremendous fictional possibilities of the Five Towns, which I had previously quite failed to discover for myself. A Mummer's Wife has influenced all my work. Even my great friend H.G. Wells had set a short story in the Potteries in 1895, The Cone. I wrote to him in 97. My dear H.G., I've been away from the Potteries 9 years, and only during the last few years have I begun to see its fictional possibilities. Particularly this year, I've been deeply impressed by it. Anyhow, I am trying to shove the notions into my next novel. An uphill task.
Letter to George Sturt, 31st of January, 1897.
My dear George, all day, and a beastly day too, I've been wanting to begin again on my novel, but couldn't centre my wits on it at all. It hasn't been seriously touched this year. I wait only for one little incident to shape itself, and then I can march on up to and right through my great revival scene in the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel. When this is sketched in, I shall consider that the first part of the book is achieved. 3 parts altogether. Yes, I have known all along that a novel must have purpose, to look at the matter from another side. It must expose some aspect of existence in which the author is deeply interested. But it mustn't be didactic. At least it must only teach in the same way as experience teaches. All which is platitude. My novels will all have purposes. The purpose of A Man from the North is to expose a few of the hardships and evils of the life of a young celibate clerk in London. As for Cis Tellwright, henceforward to be known as Anna Tellwright, if it is not a sermon against parental authority, then I say it is naught.
The Journals, 12th of September, 1898.
Partly owing to the influence of Philpotts, I have decided very seriously to take up fiction for a livelihood. A certain chronic poverty had forced upon me the fact that I was giving no attention to money-making beyond my editorship, and so the resolution came about. Till the end of 1899, I proposed to give myself absolutely to writing the sort of fiction that sells itself. My serious novel, Anna Tellwright, with which I've made some progress, is put aside indefinitely, or rather until I've seen what I can do. To write popular fiction is offensive to me, but it's far more agreeable than being tied daily to an office and editing a lady's paper, The Woman. Moreover, I think that fiction will pay better, and in order to be happy, I must have a fair supply of money.
The Journals, 18th of October, 1898.
Today I made an arrangement with Bailey by which I am only to attend at the office 4 half-days and 1 whole day in the week. As I never count office work as real work, this means that I can do 5 full days of my own work at home, excluding Sunday. I hope to devote at least 3 whole days a week to Anna Tellwright, and to resume this journal with regularity. I shall cease now to work at such high pressure as I've been driving at during the past 6 months.
31st of December, 1899.
This year I have written 335,340 words, grand total. 228 articles and stories have actually been published. Also my book of plays, Polite Farces. Also the greater part of a 55,000-word serial, Love and Life, for Tillotson's, which begins publication about April next year. Also the whole draft, 80,000 words, of my Staffordshire novel, Anna Tellwright. My total earnings were £592, 3 shillings and a penny, of which sum I have yet to receive £72.10.
From Anna of the Five Towns. Beneath them, in front, stretched a maze of roofs, dominated by the gold angel of the town hall spire. Bursley, the ancient home of the potter, has an antiquity of 1,000 years. It lies towards the north end of an extensive valley, which must have been one of the fairest spots in Alfred's England, but which is now defaced by the activities of 250,000 people. 5 contiguous towns, Turnhill, Bursley, Hanbridge, Knype and Longshore, united by a single winding thoroughfare some 8 miles in length, have inundated the valley like a succession of great lakes. Of these 5, Bursley is the mother, but Hanbridge is the largest. They are mean and forbidding of aspect, sombre, hard-featured, uncouth, and the vaporous poison of their ovens and chimneys has soiled and shrivelled the surrounding country, till there is no village lane within a league but what offers a gaunt and ludicrous travesty of rural charms. Nothing could be more prosaic than the huddled red-brown streets, nothing more seemingly remote from romance. Yet be it said that romance is even here. The romance which, for those who have an eye to perceive it, ever dwells amid the seats of industrial manufacture, softening the coarseness, transfiguring the squalor of these mighty alchemical operations. Look down into the valley from this terrace height, where love is kindling. Embrace the whole smoke-girt amphitheatre in a glance, and it may be that you will suddenly comprehend the secret and superb significance of the vast doing which goes forward below. The Journals, 17th of May, 1901.
I finished Anna Tellwright, Anna of the Five Towns, this morning at 2:45 a.m., after 17 hours continuous work, save for meals, on the last 5,000 words. I was very pleased with it, slept well for 4 hours, got up with a frightful headache, and cycled through Hemel Hempstead to St. Albans, lunched at the George, and home 42 miles. AT is 74,000 in length.
Letter from George Sturt, 15th of September, 1902. My dear Arnold, Well, I have read Anna, and behold, it is good, and I strongly approve. Bear this in mind, for I have some faults to find, and I don't want you to suppose that I think them damning. My feeling is that you haven't let yourself go sufficiently. The stuff is absolutely convincing so far as it goes, only it has partially failed to reach me where I expect first-class art to reach. The people do not come close enough. I am not intimate with them. They are real, no doubt at all about that, yet only with the reality of people seen across the street or overheard in a bus. You have studied them as though they were animals at the zoo. And all you say about them is accurate, but you have omitted to show them much more than that, which you obviously know might have shown if you had been so minded. In other words, your people are not quite creations. Instead of writing about them like the God who made them, you write as if you were a recording angel. Consequently, your book is a sort of document, a scientific treatise. You refuse to be emotional yourself. You are unimpassioned, will not take sides and all that. Consequently, you rob yourself of that help which you have a perfect right to demand from the reader, that sympathy with the subject, which would go out of your art and meet it halfway. You don't get at our imagination, but only at our intellectual judgment. Letter to H.G. Wells, 20th of September, 1902.
My dear H.G., knowing officially from you that for you no such thing as excellence exists, I will not conceal my satisfaction at your remarks about Anna. I reckon no one in this isle knows more about the craft of fiction than you, except possibly me, and I am always struck by the shrewdness of your criticisms of novels from that point of view. But I think your notions about verbal style are fundamentally wrong, and nevertheless it just happens in this instance that what you say about my style is, I think, mainly correct. There is a certain consciousness of good intentions that has jolly well got to disappear. Also, I am inclined to agree that I am not yet artistically adult at 35. I don't think the book falls off much after the death of old Price, and I think the emotional quality of the end is as good as any. As to the underdeveloped photograph, this is largely a matter of taste, but I trust you understand that the degree of development to which I have brought the photograph is what I think the proper degree. It is Turgenev's degree and Flaubert's. It is not Balzac's. Anyhow, it is the degree that comes naturally to me. I note the possibility of your having second thoughts about the book. I have had no reviews worth mentioning yet.
Letter to Lucy Simpson, 18th of June, 1903.
Dear Miss Simpson, I was very glad to have your appreciative letter, and it was very good of you to take the trouble to write it. I have been well satisfied with the general reception of the book, especially in America, but I dare say that you are aware that in the Potteries itself it has been gravely misunderstood by a lot of people. However, that can't be helped. I don't comprehend your general objection to provincial novels, seeing that the majority of all the greatest novels in the world are provincial. But Anna is not provincial at all. My characters grow out of their situations, which are not peculiar to this district alone. I returned to the Potteries in 1897, and again in December 1903, both times for family reasons. In 03, I spent an evening at the Grand Theatre, Hanley, which hadn't been built when I lived here. I could only remember sing-songs conducted by convivial chairmen with rapping hammers in public houses whose blinds were drawn and whose posters were handwritten. Now I saw an immense carved and gilded interior, like a smaller version of the Paris Opera. My first thought was, why, it's just like a real music hall. I only thought of Hanley as a place where people went to work at 7 in the morning and emerged from public houses at 11 at night, or mournful in packed tramcars, or bitterly partisan on chilly football grounds. I could scarcely credit their appearance here, lolling on velvet amid Cupids and Hercules, and smoking at ease, reclining aristocratically in the grand circle for a bob, and offered chocolates by boys dressed as if to go to Eton. And there was a vast gallery stuffed with human tuppences. Even the newspaper lad and match girl might go to the Hanley Grand, and, sitting together, drink the milk of paradise. Wonderful discoveries, these new music hall directors. They have discovered the folk. The performance was timed as carefully as a prize fight. Ting, and the curtain went unfailingly up. Ting, and it came unfailingly down. Ting, and something started. Ting, and it stopped. Everybody concerned with the show knew what he and everybody else had to do. The illuminated number signs on either side of the proscenium changed themselves with the implacable accuracy of astronomical phenomena. It was just as if some deity of 10,000 syndicated halls was controlling the show from some throne studded with electric switches in Shaftesbury Avenue. Only the uniformed shepherd of the tuppences in the gallery seemed free to use his own discretion. His intimidating, "Now then, order, please," was the sole feature of the entertainment, not regulated to the 1/5 of a second by that recurrent ting. And the entertainment. A young woman in a short skirt chanted of being clasped in his arms again. A couple of acrobatic mulatto women throbbed with bodily fever. Male acrobats gave a continual creation of sheer animal beauty. But I was waiting for the Yorkshire songsters, second item in the second half. There were 20 of them standing in a sort of flattened semicircle, the women in white and the men in scarlet hunting coats, with the conductor in knee breeches and silk stockings. Ordinary northern men and women, you could tell that, but they had class. They could really sing. They really had voices. They brought the house down every time. It was the folk themselves giving something back to the folk in artistic form. But the most touching item for me was a lady clog dancer. Hanley was the centre of a land of clogs. I've wakened in winter darkness to the sound of clogs on slushy pavements. And when I think of clogs, I think of the knocker-up, and hurried fire-lighting, and tea and thick bread, and the factory gates, and the terrible timekeeper standing there with his clock. Now clogs have nearly gone out of the working life, but here they reappear in clog dancing, once done in public houses by people who next morning would clatter to work in clogs. As I lumbered home in the electric tramcar, besieged by printed requests from the tramway company not on any account to spit, I could not help thinking and thinking in a very trite way that art is a wonderful thing. I was thankful to leave after my visit home. More short stories followed, another Five Towns novel, Whom God Hath Joined, and then my great work, The Old Wives' Tale. As long as A Man from the North, Anna, and Leonora all added together, it is a prodigious canvas, all about the Five Towns. After a sort of impulse to quit those towns, I found myself going back to them. I may tell you that I have no intention of sticking exclusively to the Five Towns. I often feel that I am short of room there. The idea for the great work had come to me 5 years before.
The Journals, 18th of November, 1903.
Last night, when I went into the Duval for dinner, a middle-aged woman, inordinately stout and with pendant cheeks, had taken the seat opposite to my prescriptive seat. The fat woman was clearly a crotchet, a maniac, a woman who lived much alone. She was repulsive. No one could like or sympathize with her. But I thought, she has been young and slim once. and I immediately thought of a long 10 or 15,000 word short story, the history of two old women. I gave this woman a sister, fat as herself, and the first chapter would be in the restaurant, both sisters, something like tonight, and written rather cruelly. Then I would go back to the infancy of these two, and sketch it all. One should have lived ordinarily, married prosaically, and become a widow. The other should have become a whore and all that, guilty splendor. Both are overtaken by fat, and they live together again in old age, not too rich, a nuisance to themselves and to others. The two lives would have to intertwine. I saw the whole work quite clearly. 10 or 15,000 words. On Sunday, the 30th of August, 1908, it was finished at 200,000 words. The book soon went out of print in England, but the American critics acclaimed it, and I am famous. In old age, the two sisters, Constance and Sophia, end up together, and turn out to have lived the same life despite their different paths. They are as they are because they live here.
Who could have foreseen it? Constance was less desolated than numbed. She was as yet only touching the fringe of her bereavement. She had not begun to think of herself. She was drenched as she gazed at Sophia's body, not by pity for herself, but by compassion for the immense disaster of her sister's life. She perceived fully now, for the first time, the greatness of that disaster. Sophia's charm and Sophia's beauty, what profit had they been to their owner? She saw pictures of Sophia's career, distorted and grotesque images formed in her untravelled mind from Sophia's own rare and compressed recitals. What a career! A brief passion, and then nearly 30 years in a boarding-house. And Sophia had never had a child, had never known either the joy or the pain of maternity. She had never even had a true home till, in all her sterile splendour, she came to Bursley, and she had ended thus. This was the piteous, ignominious end of Sophia's wondrous gifts of body and soul. Hers had not been a life at all. And the reason? It is strange how fate persists in justifying the harsh generalizations of Puritan morals, of the morals in which Constance had been brought up by her stern parents. Sophia had sinned. It was therefore inevitable that she should suffer. An adventure such as she had in wicked and capricious pride undertaken with Gerald Scales could not conclude otherwise than it had concluded. It could have brought nothing but evil. But look at her now, with her twisted face, her sightless orbs, her worn skin. She did not seem 60, but 70. She was like something used, exhausted, and thrown aside. Yes, Constance's heart melted in an anguished pity for that stormy creature. And mingled with the pity was a stern recognition of the handiwork of divine justice. To Constance's lips came the same phrase as had come to the lips of Samuel Povey on a different occasion. God is not mocked. The ideas of her parents and her grandparents had survived intact in Constance. It is true that Constance's father would have shuddered in heaven could he have seen Constance solitarily playing cards of a night. But in spite of cards, and of a son who never went to chapel, Constance, under the various influences of her destiny, had remained essentially what her father had been. Not in her was the force of evolution manifest. There are thousands such.
And with Constance's own death.
The immortal Charles Critchlow came to the funeral, full of calm, sardonic glee, and without being asked. Though fabulously senile, he had preserved and even improved his faculty for enjoying a catastrophe. He now went to funerals with gusto, contentedly absorbed in the task of burying his friends one by one. It was he who said, in his high, trembling, rasping, deliberate voice,
"It's a pity I didn't live long enough to hear his federations going on after all. That would have warranted it."
That day's signal was fuller than ever of federation.
There followed Clayhanger, where Edwin's schooldays were modelled on my own, then Hilda Lessways, and the card.
The ball at the town hall. Denry Machin has accepted a bet of £5 that he daren't ask the Countess of Chell for a dance. "Could I have this dance with you?" he demanded of the Countess, bluntly, but smiling and showing his teeth. No ceremonial title, no mention of pleasure or honour, not a trace of the formula in which Ruth Earp had instructed him. He forgot all such trivialities. "I've won that £5, Mr. Harold Itches," he said to himself. "It's nearly over, isn't it?" said the Countess, still efficiently smiling. "Oh, that doesn't matter, I'm sure," said Denry. She yielded, and he took the paradisiacal creature in his arms. Thus they waltzed together, while the flower of Bursley's chivalry gazed in enchantment. "You waltz quite nicely," she said, like an aunt, but with more than an aunt's smile. "Do I?" he beamed. Then something compelled him to say, "Do you know, it's the first time I've ever waltzed in my life, except in a lesson, you know." "Really?" she murmured. "You pick things up easily, I suppose." "Yes," he said. "Do you?" Either the question or the tone sent the Countess off into carillons of amusement. Everybody could see that Denry had made the Countess laugh tremendously. It was on this note that the waltz finished. She was still laughing when he bowed to her, as taught by Ruth Earp. He laughed too, and they parted laughing. When he had got 10 yards on his way towards Harold Itches and a £5, he felt something in his hand. The Countess's fan was sticking between his fingers. It had unhooked itself from her chain. He furtively pocketed it. Towards the end of the festivity, the rumour floated abroad that the Countess had lost her fan. The rumour reached Denry, who maintained a culpable silence. But when all was over, and the Countess was departing, he rushed down after her, and in a dramatic fashion which demonstrated his genius for the effective, he caught her exactly as she was getting into her carriage. "I've just picked it up," he said, pushing through the crowd of worshippers. "Oh, thank you very much," she said, and the Earl also thanked Denry. And then the Countess, leaning from the carriage, said, with archness in her efficient smile, "You do pick things up easily, don't you?" And both Denry and the Countess laughed without restraint, and the pillars of Bursley society were mystified.
And that is when I fell foul of the Duchess of Sutherland, whom people thought I'd taken as a model for the Countess of Chell. I wrote to her, "Dear lady, I admit that this is a bit rough on you. But then, as I told you, you are to consider yourself in the Five Towns not as a woman, but as an institution. This also is a bit rough on a beautiful woman. Believe me, with a peculiar kind of glance which is at once admiring, apologetic, and unrepentant, yours sincerely, Arnold Bennett."
"Well," said Denry in reply to Nelly's conscience, "it serves him right for making me look a fool. And besides, I can't stand uppishness. And I won't. I'm from the Five Towns, I am."
Dix, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Le moment. Bravo! Un jour de gloire est arrivé. Bravo.
I ought to explain the reason I'm here is that I'm a devotee of Arnold Bennett, and particularly The Old Wives' Tale. I've been saying for some 30 or more years this is the best novel by an Englishman written in the 20th century. My parents lived in Chiltern Court, and so I was brought up in Chiltern Court. And our eldest son, my wife and my eldest son, is called Bennett. So I'm thrilled to be here. But you should be so proud, members of the society, of what you've achieved. This is a beautiful plaque. actually created in exactly the right workshops and exactly the right pottery. And it just is, it's fantastic. And just imagine what it must be like to be an English person just driving along this little side street here in this beautiful Avon, which is part of Fontainebleau now, which was a distinct town in Arnold Bennett's day. Just driving through here, getting to the corner and looking up and seeing this. I can tell you as an English person, it just, well actually it's very moving. And you've done it. You've actually made this happen. Members of the society, 300 of you, good people. I salute you, and I'm sorry you had to be at your AGM in Stoke. Someone's got to be at an AGM, these things have to happen. But we feel very privileged to have been here at Avon at the unveiling by Denis, grandson of the great man.
Perfect.
And to think, that this is the hand that is, literally the blood coursing through his veins, coursed through the veins of the hand that just wrote in 10 months. I mean, if you are a sort of writer, as I am a sort of writer, to think that you could actually, that's the most amazing, he did it in 10 months, that was the revelation of the day, to create 200,000 words. And the cultural attaché, the sort of mayor's cultural representative, who really didn't know much about Arnold Bennett until this came up, but is really engaged. And her speech was particularly fascinating because she said, one of the lines, in case you missed it, was that she said that as a woman over 40, she was particularly interested in Arnold Bennett because the one thing she had absorbed is that he was somebody, in fact, the writer who seemed to understand women over 40. So as far as she was concerned, he had to be a good egg. And as far as we are concerned, he has to be a very good egg, not only when he's in an omelette, but particularly when he's within a great work of art, which is The Old Wives' Tale. He arrived here in the spring, got straight on with writing the book, finished it here at the end of August, and then it was published that autumn. Amazing.
With beautiful plaque.
It is a beautiful plaque. It's a beautiful plaque.
I thank you for coming, and I also thank you for your warm welcome, which has given me much pleasure. I know that my grandfather lived here, but it's the first time in my life that I've been here, and it's given me great pleasure to see this house and to see the people who are interested in his work. Thank you very much.
In this room, Arnold Bennett wrote his masterpiece, The Old Wives' Tale.
Now, like the heads of certain households in these twain, I can stand in front of my shaving mirror and say, most folk are nobodies, but I am somebody. But with these twain, I've written my last novel about my native heath. I will, however, continue to stand up for it, for without the Potteries I would be nothing.
The Journals, 25th of September, 1929.
I have written between 70 and 80 books, but also I have only written 4. The Old Wives' Tale, The Card, Clayhanger, and Riceman Steps. All the others are made a reproach to me because they are not these 4. And now Federation is come, and is a great change. But great changes do not happen suddenly. During centuries, each town of the Potteries had been nursing its individuality in the isolated remoteness of its valley or its hill, and one cannot undo the work of 700 years in 7. Now that you understand, you will not be surprised that the inhabitants regard you, the obvious stranger, with a preliminary cautiousness. To do so is the profound instinct of withdrawn communities. Nor will you be surprised later at the extraordinary heartiness of their hospitality. Such hospitality is the profound instinct of withdrawn communities. And I hope you will not be surprised at the dirt and the large slatternliness of the district's physiognomy. I hope you will drop that attitude of disgust and blame which is so foolishly characteristic of people who come from an agricultural or bureaucratic community into an industrial one. Ruskin gorgeously inveighed against the spectacular horrors of industrialism. But he would probably have been very cross if he had to drink his tea out of the hollow of his hand in default of a cup, and to keep himself warm with a skipping rope in default of coal. Yet neither cups nor coals can be produced without a great deal of dirt. You use coal, you want coal, you are very glad to have coal, and a number of other things which cannot exist without coal. And then you have the audacity to come to a coaly and clayey district and turn up your nose and say, really, this is very dirty and untidy. My good sir, what did you expect? How would you remedy it? Why, you can't even fetch 100 weight of coal out of your cellar without soiling your lily-white hands. You, as much as anybody, are responsible for the external look of things in the potteries. Forswear coal, forswear cups and saucers, and persuade others to do so, and the potteries will rapidly take on the purity of Tooting Bec.
From Whom God Hath Joined. The Prospect of the Potteries from Toft End, Sneyd Green. Railway stations, institutes, temples, colleges, graveyards, parks, baths, workshops, theatres, concerts, cafes, pawn shops, emporiums, courts of justice, banks, clubs, libraries, telephone exchanges, post offices, marriage registries, municipal buildings. What are they as they undulate below you in their complex unity, but the indestructible force that is within you? If this prospect is not beautiful under the high and darkened sky, then flowers are not beautiful, nor the ways of animals. If anything that happens in this arena of activity seems to you to need apologizing for, or slurring over, or concealing, then you have climbed to the top of Toft End in vain.
It may have the carelessness of appearance which is the inevitable result of enforced trafficking with coal and clay. But on the other hand, in no district in the world will you see more advertisements on hoardings and tramcars for soap than in the potteries.
From The Death of Simon Fuge. We stood at the corner of the side street and the main road, and down the main road a vast white rectangular cube of bright light came plunging, his head rising and dipping at express speed and with a formidable roar. Mr. Brindley imperiously raised his stick. The extraordinary box of light stopped as if by a miracle, and we jumped into it, having splashed through mud, and it plunged off again, bump, 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 into the town of Bursley. As Mr. Brindley passed into the interior of the tramcar, he said laconically to two men who were smoking on the platform, "How do, Jim? How do, Joe?" And they responded laconically, "How do, Bob? How do, Bob?" We sat down. Mr. Brindley pointed to the condition of the floor. "Cheerful, isn't it?" he observed to me, shouting above the din of the vibrating glass. Our fellow passengers were few and unromantic. Perhaps half a dozen altogether, on the long, shiny yellow seats of the tramcar, each apparently lost in gloomy reverence. "It's the advertisements and notices in these cars are the joy of the superman like you and me," shouted Mr. Brindley. "Look there. Passengers requested not to spit on the floor. Simply an encouragement to lie on the seats and spit on the ceiling, isn't it? Wear only Noble's wonderful boots. Suppose we did. Unless they came well up above the waist, we should be prosecuted. However, there's no sense of humour in this district."
In my youth there existed less than 2 miles of tram line in the entire district, and only 2 trams, drawn by horses and travelling between Hanley and Burslem, twice an hour. Now electric tramcars in scores run about everywhere, from Longton in the south to Tunstall in the north, and from Newcastle in the west to Smallthorne in the east. And it was precisely these rapid tramcars which at last broke down the stubborn individualism of the separate towns, and brought about their federation and the triumph of Hanley, the central and largest town. Another case of geography influencing history. Hanley was in the middle. These trams were always flying to Hanley, and the large shops and places of amusement were very tempting. And so the large shops and other establishments grew larger and more numerous, and they are still growing and increasing, and Hanley will soon have a population of 100,000. Inevitably the retail trade of the other towns languished. Useless for the other towns to complain. Useless to fight against the temptation of those trams. For a penny or twopence in a quarter of an hour the man or woman with money to spend could be in Hanley, and not all his love for his native town would keep that man or woman out of Hanley. Thus, a smaller patriotism was gradually overcome by a greater patriotism, and the tendency of the potters to think of themselves as one single community instead of half a dozen communities was strengthened. And though each town still protests against losing its identity will undoubtedly have to go. The loss is part of the price paid for progress and for breadth of mind. Even Hanley, the victor, has had to sacrifice something. It would have liked the Federated Potteries to be baptized with its own name. But in the struggle for nomenclature, Stoke-on-Trent has won, and rightly, for it is the centre of the railway system and of the postal system. To the outside world of travellers and addressers of envelopes, the Potteries has always been associated with Stoke-on-Trent, and the association will properly remain. Federation! What a battle! And what grand material for the great work!
From The Old Wives' Tale. Was the name of Bursley to be lost to the world? To ask the question was to give the answer. Then dawned the day of battle, the day of the poll, when the burgesses were to indicate plainly by means of a cross on a voting paper whether or not they wanted federation. All partisans of federation sported a red ribbon. All anti-federationists sported a blue ribbon. The schools were closed, and the federationists displayed their characteristic lack of scruple in appropriating the children. The federationists, with devilish skill, had hired the Bursley Town Silver Prize Band, an organisation of terrific respectability, and had set it to march playing through the town, followed by wagonettes crammed with children who sang, "Vote, vote, vote for federation, don't be stupid, old and slow. We are sure that it will be good for the community, so vote, vote, vote and make it go." How this performance could affect the decision of grave burgesses at the polls was not apparent, but the anti-federationists feared that it might, and before noon was come, they had engaged 2 bands, and had composed in committee the following lyric in reply to the first one. "Down, down, down with federation, as we are we'd rather stay. When the vote on Sat is read, federation will be dead. Good old Bursley's sure to win the day." They had also composed another song, entitled "Dear Old Bursley," which, however, they made the fatal error of setting to the music of Auld Lang Syne. The effect was that of a dirge, and perhaps influenced many voters in favour of the more cheerful party. The Federationists, as one of their prominent opponents admitted, had it all their own way, dominating both the streets and the walls. And when, in the early afternoon, Mr. Dick Povey sailed over the town in a balloon that was plainly decorated with the crimson of Federation, it was felt that the cause of Bursley's separate identity was forever lost. Still, Bursley, with the willing aid of the public houses, maintained its gaiety.
All things considered, the Potteries has learned very quickly its lesson of closer contact with the world. It has not yet shed the whole of its primitive temperament, and in all probability it never will, at any rate I hope not. But its progress has been remarkable. Little by little it's become studded with municipal institutions and organizations of amenity of all kinds. Its public life has quickened and developed activities as complicated as may be found in any of your swagger municipalities. Most important of all, perhaps, it has grown conscious of its own ugliness, and has seriously set about to titivate itself. Municipal parks flourish and blossom now in every quarter of it. There are at least half a dozen. A municipal park may seem to you a very little thing, but I tell you that in a district martyrized by smoke and fumes, a municipal park is a very great thing indeed, an achievement that approaches the heroic. Swords do not grow of their own accord in the Potteries. The municipal gardeners will tell you that each blade of grass has to be brought up, as it were, by hand. And in the matter of titivation and beautifying, there is even now a movement for abating the smoke nuisance. Just as some years ago a small band of enthusiasts convinced themselves that federation must come, and federation did come in the teeth of intense instinctive opposition, so now a small band of enthusiasts have convinced themselves that smoke must go. And though the project seems a dream, and though people inured to dirt will cling to dirt, yet I believe that smoke ultimately will go. But the characters remain.
A little group of councillors were discussing Denry. "What a card," said one, laughing joyously. "He's a rare and no mistake." "Of course, this'll make him more popular than ever," said another. "We've never had a man to touch him for that." "And yet," demanded Councillor Barlow, "what's he done? Has he ever done a day's work in his life? What great cause is he identified with?" "He's identified," said the speaker, "with the great cause of cheering us all up."